Welcome to this Media Defence webinar on freedom of expression in times of war. My name is Pádraig Hughes. I'm the Legal Director at Media Defence, and I should note at the outset that this webinar is being recorded. The importance of ensuring accurate reporting on an armed conflict can be seen on an almost daily basis as the media and online social media platforms cover the war in Ukraine. War reporting can shape public opinion on matters such as whether outside states or organizations intervene in a conflict, the nature of that intervention, and even how parties conduct themselves during the conflict. The coverage of the Ukraine war might be unprecedented. Major news organizations around the world have embedded journalists in Ukraine to cover bombings and violence in hard-hit towns and cities across broadcast, digital, and print media. Journalists, civilians, and politicians have taken to social media networks like TikTok, Telegram, and Twitter to document the horrors of the war for a global audience in real time. The amount of live tweeting by international reporters, local media, and citizen journalists who are posting images, videos, and descriptions of military movements and atrocities may also be unprecedented. However, reporting on war is a dangerous business, and the number of journalists killed or injured so far during this conflict is clear evidence of that. In Ukraine, restrictions have been imposed on the media in terms of what they can report on. In Russia, new legislation provides that even mentioning the word war may result in a criminal conviction with a 15-year prison sentence. These dangers can be seen in other conflicts around the world. At Media Defence, we continue to support journalists who are reporting on the war in Yemen and who are being detained with no prospect of challenging that detention for an independent judicial body. In the context of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, we represent journalists at the European Court of Human Rights who were killed and injured in a bombing in 2020. So the impact of war on freedom of expression is widespread, but for today, the focus is on Ukraine. And I'm delighted to be joined today by three panelists who will be able to provide us with valuable insights into the question of how freedom of expression is faring at this moment in Ukraine, each with a slightly different perspective. I'm joined by Danilo Mokryk, a Ukrainian anti-corruption investigative journalist at Bihus.info and a political publicist. Since the Russian invasion of 2022, he is focused on documenting and explaining Russian war crimes and acts of genocide in Ukraine. Maxim Dvorovyi is a Kyiv-based digital rights and media law and policy expert and is currently legal counsel with the Digital Security Lab Ukraine and the Commission on Journalistic Ethics. Olga Grigorovska is a legal officer with Media Defence and is currently working on cases being taken to the European Court of Human Rights in the context of this war. Olga previously worked as a lawyer at the European Court. At the end of the presentations, there will be an opportunity to answer some questions, but for now, we'll start with Danilo. Danilo, perhaps you can give us some insights into the challenges you and your colleagues are facing in reporting during the war.
Yes, I will talk about some obvious challenges and some that are perhaps less obvious. Well, to mention first the most obvious things is the reporting is dangerous in Ukraine, especially for those who are reporting from the front lines, but not only from them. We know that a few journalists in Ukraine have been killed by Russian missiles when they were at home, for example, like Vera Hirich, who was working for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. She was killed by a missile while being at home in Kyiv. We have quite a few cases of journalists killed by Russians near the front lines. And there is, for example, the case of one of the most renowned Ukrainian photo reporters, Max Levin, one of the best Ukrainian documentalists, who was killed in Kyiv region during the Russian occupation. And a recent investigation by Reporters Without Borders says that he actually might have been executed by Russians on purpose. It was not just, some situation that got out of control. That he was. We have cases, quite a few cases of kidnappings of journalists, and the situation of Ukrainian journalists on occupied territories is really dangerous. I mean, Kherson region, first of all. I know that some Ukrainian journalists who remain there have to move all the time, not disclosing their whereabouts to even their family. So they have to practically live in hiding. This is probably, well, the most obvious part of what I was going to say. Now, there are also, there is a set of challenges we have to overcome when reporting, or sometimes not to overcome, but to deal with. For example, there is this, the general context we are working in as Ukrainian journalists is the context of Ukraine as an independent state and as a nation being threatened to be wiped out. So we as Ukrainian journalists, we also remain citizens, and we are aware of this danger. We are aware of this threat, and it puts us in a very particular psychological context when we also must think about not helping the enemy, not helping, not helping to destroy our state, not helping to kill Ukrainians, not doing harm. Well, the most obvious, maybe the simplest example of this is the question of how we report on Russian shellings or missile strikes. Excuse me. When we have to keep the information limited, as to where the missile, where the shells have struck exactly, so as not to help Russians to follow up with more precise strikes. So this is like the simplest, but there are a lot of more nuanced things about whether I report on this or on that, or if I do, when do I report on it, and how thorough am I in reporting on some particular event or circumstances. I will not go into details. Is just one thing I want to make clear. It's not about being a propagandist, and it's not about hiding the truth. It's about knowing when and where I can report on something without doing more harm than good. Because it's, to me, it was always the question I have to ask myself, even in relatively peaceful times, whether the information I am reporting to does more good to the public than more harm. As an investigative journalist, I often work with sensitive data, some leaked stuff, and so on and so on. And I also have to weigh every time if this is worth reporting, or whether it is reporting on this is doing more good than harm. And this context, this problematic, it grows exponentially in times of war. Another problem is, as you mentioned, this war is very well documented. The flow of information, the flow of testimonies, the flow of videos, pictures is unprecedented, and the importance of the information is also very, very high. In times of peace, well, it is said that news lives for 3 days. In February and March, we had important news overshadowing everything that happened before every 10 minutes. And as an investigative reporter, again, I am used to, work with documents or with information for weeks, analyzing it, fact checking it. Now this time scale is much tighter. You have less time to check all the facts. You have less time to analyze because you are overloaded with information, and it is easy to make mistakes in such a context when you're so overloaded. Sometimes, let's say you have 10 testimonies that are accurate, and they are accurate, and there is an 11th one that is very good and is completely in line with everything you've known before. It is completely in line with what you know to be true. So given this overflow of information, you may be, sometimes tempted to just take it for granted without checking it. Like, okay, I know this is true. I take this, and this is how you make mistakes. Because you know this to be true, so you just you just take the testimony, you just take the video, you just take the photo without checking it thoroughly, and it can lead to bad to bad consequences, actually, because and this is also a part of being a citizen, because if you report on something that is flawed, if you report flawed information, if you make a mistake, you are actually harming your cause. You are actually harming not only your reputation as a journalist, but also Ukraine, because Russian propaganda will take each mistake and will amplify it, and will say, Ukrainians lie. So you have to make special attention to not make mistakes, to not feed Russian propaganda and this narrative that, well, Ukrainians lie, Ukrainians are producing fakes. Also, sometimes mistakes just happen, and officials in Ukraine may make mistakes. One of the most famous examples is the 8th of April with the Russian missile attack on a train station in Kramatorsk, when an advisor to Zelensky chief of staff, Alexei Arestovich, in like 10-15 minutes after the strike, wrote that the strike was carried out by an Iskander missile, which was not true. The strike was carried out by .U missile, and Volodymyr Zelensky corrected it some 10-15 minutes later. But this one mistake, this inaccuracy, led Russians to say, Ukrainians lie, Ukrainians are trying to cover up what really happened in Kramatorsk. Actually, they carried out the strike, and this cover-up, this supposed cover-up, attempted cover-up, this mistake by Alexei Arestovich, is somehow an indirect proof that Ukrainians are trying to hide something. It was a mistake, and such mistakes happen, and they are harmful. So this is a part of the challenges we are dealing with. Also, another and somehow an opposite challenge is that on the occupied territories, especially in the Kherson region, Russians are trying to sever the connection to internet connection, mobile connection in the occupied territories, and it's extremely difficult to reach people there. It's extremely difficult, you know, to get the testimonies, to find out what is going there. And it seems to be their real tactics, because we've seen it, for example, in March in the Kyiv region, in Bucha, or Irpin, or some other towns in the north of Ukraine, when during some times we didn't really have a lot of information about what was going on there. And to me, as a reporter, I was trying to report on war crimes and to prove genocide. It poses like serious challenges. As for proving genocide, there are some additional challenges, because when you're talking about genocide, what you have to do is to prove intent, because this is a crime that is defined by its intent. It's not enough to say, well, people were killed, a lot of people were executed, a lot of people were deported, which is also one of the characteristics of genocide. You know, you have to prove that it was done with the intent of destroying the population in whole or in part. So it's also a challenge. But you know, one thing I will finish with, which worries me, is that I am observing somehow a depreciation of witness accounts, of testimonies. We are living in an age when you can fake a video, when you can easily fake a photo, and people are trying to, and Russian propaganda is trying to somehow challenge the truth of even the Bucha massacre. They have photos, they have videos, they have satellite imagery, and still they are trying, they are saying that this is all untrue, this is all staged, this is all Photoshop, this is all fake videoed. And it's a problem, because there are cases when where we will not have photos and videos, where only things we will have are witness accounts. I'm thinking about rapes, for example. Well, the only thing you as a reporter will have when reporting on systematic rapes by Russian soldiers are witness accounts, and often anonymous witness accounts. You will not have videos, you will not have pictures, and thank God. And this, you know, this context in which we live in, of challenging everything, of attacking every information, of dismissing videos, pictures, satellite imagery, is very worrying. Because on one hand, yes, we have, this war is really documented at an unprecedented level. But on the other hand, the attacks on truth are also unprecedented, it seems to me. Because I remember I read, when I read, you know, investigations in Washington Post in 1980s. Well, there are just accounts sometimes, just witness accounts. Now, what you have this enormous volumes of information, and somehow it is often not enough. So this is, I will rest at this.
Thank you, Danilo. That was a really comprehensive overview of the difficulties of operating in the context of Russian aggression, trying to balance your journalistic duties with avoiding harm to citizens, and the importance the key importance of ensuring the accuracy of the journalism that you're undertaking. Max, maybe we can turn to you now. You can maybe put a legal spin on what Danilo has talked about.
Yes, sure. But before proceeding to the legal side of what's going on, I would like to add some things to what Danilo has said, to the obstacles which journalists face, also in terms of journalistic ethics, because one of the main problems in the current conflict, as Danilo rightfully mentioned, is the speed with which the information emerges. And this creates a major obstacle for the work of independent media, who are well trained to verify whichever information they see. And they just cannot put something on their websites or on their social media pages which is not verified. But in Ukrainian and well, in the context of the former Soviet Union states, there is a significant competition to the journalists and the media, and those are the Telegram channels. The Telegram is the messenger where you can create channels to which the authors almost all the time anonymously can post whichever information they want to. They post their the content which is filmed by their subscribers, some authored content, again frequently anonymous. And what they do is that they both satisfy the thirst of the audience to receive the information fast, especially the information on the shellings, on the missile strikes. And well, this can be quite easily explained, because if you see that somewhere in the news that the missile struck your own city, your native city, you're just trying to search whichever piece of information to understand whether it hit or did not hit your own house, or whether it touched upon your relatives. And in search for that information, you usually go to those anonymous Telegram channels. And while they provide the information fastly, it is vastly unreliable, and it also can create significant harm to those who post it, because it might actually aid in correcting the fire of the Russian armed forces. Actually, one of the examples of a similar thing. So I live in Kyiv, close to the shopping mall, which was bombed by Russians. And when the Russian armed forces were showing the video how they fired a missile on that shopping mall, they also put next to it the video of the user, either in TikTok or on Instagram, but which spread actively in Telegram, which demonstrated the fact that this shopping mall actually housed a warehouse with the Ukrainian weaponry. So all this actually demonstrates that the opposing armed forces actively use information from social media to actually aim better at targets. So every journalist is also a citizen, and every lawyer and civic activist is also first and foremost the citizen. And here we come to the legal point of view, because of course, the Russian aggression, well, I cannot even call it right now, the aggression, the renovation of aggression, or the renewal of aggression, or whatever we call what happened on the 24th of February, it led, of course, to the introduction of some of the laws, some of pieces of legislation which impose criminal liability on certain types of speech. As I will demonstrate further, some of those pieces of legislation would most likely constitute a disproportionate interference with the freedom of expression. But the thing is, we as civil activists or civil society, we also try to self-censor ourselves in our concerns regarding this legislation, because we understand that any significant criticism of the governmental decisions right now would play into the enemy's hands. And therefore, while we are like monitoring all those legal initiatives and trying to use the informal channels or informal contacts with the MPs and the governmental officials to point their attention that, look, maybe you just try to soften this norm, or maybe you try to amend this norm as far as the situation softens a bit, we can't really go public and criticizing the government. So as to the newly introduced norms, we have to remember that actually Ukraine has introduced a number of pieces, a number of laws which restricted Russian origin speech long before the 24th of February 2022. And I won't really elaborate on them much right now. For those interested, I will just give the link into the chat with one report I prepared last year, where you have almost all of those legal initiatives explained and their analysis from the standpoint of human rights law. Right now, we had 5 norms introduced to the legislation, which are aimed at both combating Russian aggression, but also they interfere with freedom of expression. So chronologically, one of the first pieces of legislation which were introduced was the norm added to the criminal code of Ukraine, which penalizes defamation and insult of the members of the armed forces. We all understand that in usual circumstances, defamation and insults are not being criminalized in the democratic societies, even if they relate specifically to the members of the armed force. But like, this norm currently imposes the possibility of up to 5 years imprisonment for disseminating such statements. We can understand that, of course, this norm might have a legitimate aim of protecting national security in the current situation, but the possible punishment, of course, goes beyond what is expected from such norms. So this was the first piece of legislation which was introduced. I do not know currently of any judgments on this article in the criminal code, partly because until recently the public court register where all the judgments and decisions of our Ukrainian local courts are being published was closed, but as of now, I haven't really heard loud cases about this. But still, this norm in peaceful times, and probably even in the current state of martial law, would not be, the punishment for this norm would not be proportionate from the standpoint of international human rights law. The second norm, which was introduced also to the criminal code, was the justification or denial of the armed aggression of Russian Federation of Ukraine, which began in 2014. Norm can be understandable in the current context again, because it is directly the thing which is which aims at protecting national security interests, and it can also be more or less aligned with the prohibition on the propaganda of war and some of the other norms in international law, which prohibit the denial of clearly established historical facts, although by this moment the European Court of Human Rights had only recognized Holocaust as being this one and only clearly established historical fact. But it can be debatable that this fact may also be clearly established from the Ukrainian standpoint. And for violation of this norm, the perpetrator faces also the sanction in form of imprisonment, and it may lead up to 8 years of imprisonment if such statements were disseminated in mass media. The small problem with this is, unfortunately, Ukrainian courts sometimes treat internet, yes, just internet, not online media, but internet, as mass media. So that means that merely for disseminating social media posts with those statements, you may face imprisonment up to 8 years. Again, norm most likely faces legitimate aim, most likely is necessary in a democratic society. Proportionality is disputable. The sanction might have been less, might have been smaller. The third norm, which was introduced, prohibits the collaboration, and collaboration with the enemy also involves calls for justification or denial of the armed aggression, and so on, so on, so on. This norm, first and foremost, prohibits the perpetrators from actually getting a number of posts, so that essentially it limits the perpetrators' rights to employment for 10 to 15 years at some official positions, and sometimes also in other spheres. So this is another thing which journalists and those who are reporting on the conflict have to bear in mind, that they have to be very accurate in these aspects. The fourth norm, which was introduced, directly relates to dissemination of information about the duty stations of Ukrainian armed forces, of transportation of army supplies to Ukrainian armed forces, and actually was created as a result of that missile strike on the shopping mall I was talking to you previously about. And this norm, also introduced into the criminal code, prohibits the dissemination of information of movements of Ukrainian armed forces and armed supplies, and can also lead, with some aggravating circumstances, up to 12 years of imprisonment. And as far as I remember, there were a couple of cases and a couple of judgments delivered by the Ukrainian courts on this norm, and one of them led to 10 years imprisonment for one of the social media users. Again, norm can be recognized as pursuing a legitimate aim. Most likely it is necessary in a democratic society if we speak about this three-part test enshrined in Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights, but proportionality of the punishment would most likely be questionable, and would most likely be too much if dissemination of this information had not led to any significant violence or any significant harm. And the most recent prohibition, which was introduced, was not yet introduced to the criminal code, but it expands to merely disseminating information in various types of media. And this is the prohibition of the propaganda of, let me quote, of the Russian Nazi totalitarian regime and its aggressions. And it also mentions something about the terrorist state. So effectively, by the introduction of that law, Ukraine recognized Russian Federation as the terrorist state and prohibit any propaganda of its activities and activities of its public officials in relation to armed aggression on Ukraine. And it also prohibits the demonstration of the Russian invasion symbols, the infamous V and Z symbols, which are frequently used by Russian armed forces on their military equipment during their armed attack. No criminal punishment on this issue yet, but this prohibition currently exists. And once again, we do not yet know what would be possible punishment for disseminating this information, but like, yes, the prohibition pursues a legitimate aim, most likely is necessary in a democratic society. Proportionality, we will have to have a look at that. Again, we do not have, as I already mentioned, the exact data on how all those norms were applied, but all these things have to be borne in mind by journalists, not only Ukrainian, but foreign journalists currently working in the Ukrainian context, and also by social media users, because we understand the legitimate interests of restricting such speech, and we understand that it may be harmful to the Ukrainian cause, and it may be harmful to the Ukrainian armed forces, but having 10 years imprisonment for speech crimes, even in times of martial law and even in the times of armed aggression, might be a bit too much, and at some point in future might lead to some of the very interesting cases in the European Court of Human Rights, which will reshape the current balance of freedom of expression, and which will reshape the freedom of expression paradigm, especially in terms of the Article 17 jurisprudence and in terms of the speech which runs contrary to the values enshrined by the convention, which usually covers Holocaust denials, propaganda of Nazi regime, hate speech, the most brutal forms of hate speech, and so on, so on, so on. And with that in mind, I will pass the floor to Olga, who will elaborate on, albeit a bit different, but still the aspects of the European Court of Human Rights jurisprudence on the current war.
If I might, I would just like to ask one question, just quickly. The first changes to the criminal code about the defamation against Ukrainian army and so on, which article of the criminal code is it? I cannot find it.
It's Article 435(1) of the Criminal Code.
431.
435(1).
Okay,
Thanks, Max, for that contribution. And obviously, as you outlined, the harm that arises from careless dissemination of information is directly connected to all of these pieces of legislation that are now being introduced. And it'll be interesting to see how and if they are resolved in some way in the future at the European Court level. Olga, I'm going to turn to you now, and perhaps you can give us some insights into some of the recent cases that we filed at the European Court connected to the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, of course, thanks. So yeah, I think I'll just briefly talk about the cases that we recently took to the European Court of Human Rights, cases directly concerning the war against Ukraine. The first one, well, they both concern journalists, of course, and the first case is of Ukrainian journalist Oleg Baturin. This case was brought to our attention by the Ukrainian Human Rights Platform, and we cooperated with, we submitted the application and the applicant's complaints together with his lawyer, Andrei Leshchenko. The first case of Oleg's case concerns his abduction, because he's been very active in reporting since 2014. Actually, he's been working as a journalist for a long time in Kherson region, in Nova Kakhovka and Kakhovka. But since 2014, he's been focusing mostly on reporting extensively on Russia's aggression against Ukraine, including Crimea, in Donetsk and Luhansk region. And of course, following the invasion on 24th of February, he also actively participated in the demonstrations, pro-Ukrainian demonstrations in the beginning of March in Kakhovka, and he was reporting from there as a journalist. But on 12th of March, he was abducted by Russian military state agents, basically in his hometown, and he was brought to Russian-controlled territory, because at the time the city of Kakhovka was not yet under full control. His hometown was not yet under full control of Russia, but then he was brought just 15 minutes away to Novakakhovka and then later to Kherson, cities which unfortunately already fallen under full Russian control at that time. He was detained, questioned, interrogated. He was tortured on his way to those cities, and constantly while in detention, where he was held in detention, he was constantly tortured. He was interrogated about his activities as a journalist. He was questioned about the names of activists and organizers of pro-Ukrainian demonstrations in the region. He was asked to give up names of those activists and their addresses. He spent 9 days in detention in Kherson and Novakakhovka, and fortunately he was released after that. And right now he's in Ukraine, in the outside of region controlled by Russia. And the second case we took is the case of Alexandra Kovshinova. who was only 24 when she died. She was working. She was prior to her work and covering the war in Ukraine in February, the invasion in February. She was a documentary film producer and a journalist, and she started cooperating with working for Fox News agency in January prior to the invasion. And on 14th of March, she and the Fox News crew with few other journalists, Benjamin Hall and cameraman Yevhenii Sakun, they were on their way to Irpin, and they stopped near a village of Horenka, where they were struck by the artillery attack by Russian armed forces. And as a result, Alexandra, she died at the scene. The cameraman also died at the scene, and the only surviving member of the team is Benjamin Hall. We obviously we brought these two cases before the European Court of Human Rights, concentrating on violations or on substantive violations of the substantive rights. In case of Oleg Baturin, it was his right. It was his right under Article 3 and 5 because he was tortured and unlawfully and arbitrarily detained. But obviously, it was since such an attack on his rights was carried out in connection with his journalistic activity and his pro-Ukrainian position and his covering of Russian invasion. Obviously, Article 10 is a very important argument that we made in these applications. In case of Alexandra Kuvshinova, since she died, it's her right to life, Article 2 and Article 10, because she was working as a journalist at the time of her death, and she was attacked as a group of Fox News agency crew, and they were carrying out their journalistic activities in the region when they were attacked. Obviously, apart from that, I think the most important arguments were made, and in context of ongoing war, of international military conflict, very important arguments were made under Article 1, which is about the state jurisdiction. And under the court's established case law, there are two main categories of extraterritorial jurisdiction. The first one is the state agent authority or control, and the second is effective control over an area. In the case of Oleg Baturin, we submitted that the case fell within the jurisdiction of Russia within the meaning of Article 1, based on both factors, actually, because in Oleg Baturin's case, the applicant, first of all, he fell under the extraterritorial jurisdiction of Russia because he was abducted by Russian state agents, and because throughout his detention he was under their constant control. And second is also the territorial argument, which is effective control over an area, which also was an important factor in this case because the applicant was brought to the territory, which was effectively controlled at the time by Russian authorities, by the Russian state. It has been reported by independent agencies. It has been actually reported by the Russian Ministry of Defense. I think it was on 15th March when they reported that they considered Kherson region and Kherson completely under their control. So in this case, both of these arguments, both of these factors were present. As to the case of Sasha, of Alexandra Kuvshinova, we argued that Russia had extraterritorial jurisdiction because at the time of her death, Russian armed forces, they killed her by bombing the civilian vehicle she was in. So they produced effects outside of their own territory, and they exercise authority and control over her and over the vehicle where other journalists were present as well. So in this case, the artillery attack, it took place as a specific and isolated incident. So we can say for sure that this was a targeted attack. The journalists, where they were traveling in the civilian vehicle, and just before the attack, the Russian drones were seen, and the artillery attack, the circumstances of this artillery attack, which destroyed the civilian car where Alexandra was, they suggest this was a targeted attack and specified attack against journalists. All of the journalists, Alexandra and Ben and Benjamin and Pierre, they were all wearing protective vests and protective gear with markings press. And before the attack, we also know that Benjamin and Pierre, they were all both outside of the vehicle, so they could be seen by the drones prior to the attack. So for these reasons, again, we argued that the case fell within Russia's extraterritorial jurisdiction. And another argument, another complaint that we made, which is a novel one and which has not been considered by the court in cases like that on many occasions, is the Article 17. We decided to bring this this argument because this specifically in these conditions, in these circumstances of the war, of the Russian aggression against Ukraine, against the Ukrainian nation, we believe that that this could be a case where the court should actually examine Russia's actions as such that are aimed at destructions of applicants' rights. So Article 17 of the Convention prohibits any state to perform any act aimed at the destruction of rights or freedoms set forth in the Convention, or the limitation to a greater extent than is provided in the Convention. And it has two effects. Firstly, it prevents states from using any of the provisions of the Convention in order to destroy the rights and freedoms. And secondly, it prevents the states from relying on the Convention provisions in order to limit the rights and freedoms guaranteed under the Convention. Article 17 has been relied on in alleging that the state has acted in a manner aimed at the destruction of rights and freedoms in the Convention before. But so far, no state has ever been condemned on this ground. So that's our hoping that in these cases, the court will find Russia guilty of violating Article 17. While the court has considered claims of Article 17, of violation of Article 17 by states in very few cases, it still has identified two important factors that require consideration when the court assesses whether there has been a violation of Article 17. And these are the factors that we based our arguments on in both cases. The first one is that we argued that Russia created a sort of a totalitarian situation and state, especially in the occupied territories of Ukraine, which they control right now. And the second one is that the purpose of Russia's treatment of the applicants was to destroy their rights. And when we are discussing the first argument about the totalitarian situation, I think as Maxim already mentioned as well, there have been systematic attacks on journalists covering the war and covering Russia's invasion. They've been abducted, they've been tortured, they've been killed. We also know in many cases that Russian armed forces have been targeting journalists, media in the attacks, in the military attacks. And apart from that, in the regions which are under current control of Russia, they deliberately attack Ukrainian media and internet infrastructure. The Ukrainian TV channels and media have been replaced by Russian channels. Access to independent websites and media is effectively banned or restricted. And Russia is effectively controlling the narrative and the control of access to information. Russia is also restricting rights of individuals in the controlled areas to protest against Russian occupation. And we know a lot of facts about creating the so-called filtration camps. As in, we argued in Oleg Baturin's case that in Kherson region alone, there were created filtration camps for the purpose of identifying individuals supporting the Ukrainian government. And they've been brought there by force, they've been held there, they've been tortured, and they are held in detention. There are a lot of other incidents and facts that could support the argument of creating that Russia has created this totalitarian situation, especially in the occupied regions. And the second one is that these actions are deliberate, and there was an intent to create such situation. And this can be drawn from plenty of statements of Russian officials and those of Russian president who has explained that the Russian policy is to target Ukrainians as a national group and to deny Ukraine's right to exist as a sovereign nation. There are plenty of other numerous statements of government officials that support this Russian national policy sort of destruction of Ukraine and Ukrainians. So by arguing both of these, that both of these factors are present in these cases, we also submitted that Russia violated Article 17 of the Convention, aiming at destruction of the applicants' rights. Yeah.
Thank you, Olga, for running through those two cases. Those cases were filed, I think, Monday and last Thursday, so they've just been sent to the European Court of Human Rights. And the Article 17 argument is, as Olga says, quite a novel argument, very much dependent on information relating to the situation in the areas that Russia has occupied, in relation to treatment of the media, filtration camps, as Olga said, but also in relation to the way in which the curriculum in schools has been changed, people have been forcibly removed from regions, and so on. We have a question for you, Danilo, regarding news gathering, essentially, and your sources. So the question is, has the nature of your sources or the way you find out about first-hand accounts changed since the war started? And if so, how has that happened?
Well, yeah, it has changed very much, because my work before the February 24th was a work of an anti-corruption journalist who had his sources mainly among the officials, you know, the law enforcement agencies and so on. Now, my sources are mostly just, you know, ordinary people. So I had never had, you know, this specific experience of wartime reporting and finding sources among general population, if I may say. So yes, it is very different, and well, I do have, for example, when I am trying to find sources and witness accounts from the Kherson region, I am talking to people from the Kherson region, from Kherson. They know people there, so it's about building, you know, a network. It's actually it's a bit different, because you know, the main difference is that as an anti-corruption journalist, I have often had sources coming forward to me without specifically looking for them, you know. This is different. This time I have to even persuade people to tell me a story, and to persuade them that it would be safe for them, because once again, I have to stress that some people I am talking to, they are on the occupied territories and they are in danger. And even the fact that they are talking to me is a high stakes endeavor for them. It's not about, you know, if an official may be afraid of, I don't know, being fired, okay? Now we are talking about life. We are talking about sometimes deeply existential experiences. We are talking about violence, you know, some people, not only in the cases of rape, but even in cases of just bodily violence, physical violence, they still may be reluctant to talk about it because it is humiliating. It is an existential experience. And it is also much harder to talk to them, for me psychologically, I mean, because, well, corruption is one thing. Hearing the first-hand accounts about torture, about rape, talking to people who have had their little children killed, for example, it's quite a different story. So it changes in directions of contact, it changes in substance, and ultimately it also changes on the toll it has on you. So this is the difference.
Thank you, Danilo. Max, if I could ask you a question that's been provided to us, could you tell us a little more about instances of digital threats and attacks on journalists in Ukraine since the February invasion, and what measures have been taken in response?
Yes, so the issue of digital attacks on journalists is, well, actually predates the 24th of February. So lots of journalists were became threats of both phishing attacks and harassment and online violence long before the war. And well, to be fair, this hasn't really been 100% connected with the war itself, because lots of journalists were attacked by the politicians or politicians' proxies who didn't like the investigative reports, and this is the thing which occurred for quite some time in Ukraine. With the beginning of the war, the digital attacks continued as usual, in the sense that well, they merely continued. So not much has changed. I cannot really say that the scale of this attack really rose. That's just the nature of those attacks differed, and maybe the one thing which became a bit more frequent is the attacks on social media in a way of coordinated bot attacks on the posts of users, because as a result of the firing up of the war, of course, journalists and activists who disseminate reliable content, or even sometimes disseminate just the content which is uncomfortable for Russians, they more frequently became victims of coordinated reporting of their posts, and of course algorithmic systems of content moderation on social media. They barely adequately respond to that. We had numerous cases when the journalists' profiles on social media were banned for disseminating content related to war, which, well, breached community standards of those social media in terms of extreme violence, nudity, and so on. But clearly, that content they posted actually bore significant evidentiary value for proving war crimes and, well, international crimes in general. And this mostly became a problem of exploitation by Russians of the inherent problems of the social media policies. And major online platforms had been, I might say, reluctant to amend those policies and adequately react to the emergence of this new type of content. So this is a problem which mostly relies on the blame should mostly be put, of course, on the social media and their extreme reliance on algorithmic content moderation tools, which they are very reluctant to change, and to change the ratio of well, human moderation to algorithm moderation.
Thank you, Max. We're running out of time, but I have one more question for Olga, and connected to what you mentioned about the difficulties in gathering evidence. Olga, I guess this question goes more to Sasha's case than Oleg Baturn's case. The difficulties encountered, leaving out obviously the controversial parts of that question that we had encountered during the filing of the case, but the difficulties encountered in gathering evidence in the context of the type of activity carried out by Russia in Sasha's case.
Yes, thank you. That's absolutely, I think that was one of the challenges in this case, because obviously in the context of war, of the ongoing war, and especially in a case like that, when the applicant, when the journalist died as a result of artillery attack, it is really difficult to gather evidence, especially since the domestic criminal proceedings are ongoing. And there were almost no witnesses, and the only surviving witness was just another journalist. The only surviving journalist, Benjamin, and the car, actually, the vehicle where Alexandra was, it was found by Ukrainian military, and they actually saved Benjamin, but they were maybe the only ones also who were at the scene and could see what happened afterwards. So obviously it's very difficult to get any evidence in a case like that, to rely on the testimony, because we don't have, first of all, we don't have many witnesses. And second of all, because, well, as I mentioned, the Ukrainian military officers who saved Benjamin and who arrived at the scene later, they are also right now in the war, in the front line. So getting their testimony was extremely difficult as well. We did manage to get one testimony from someone who was involved directly. And as Danilo mentioned, it's very difficult because parents and relatives of Alexandra, of course, they were also filling us in on the details of how they learned about her death and how it happened, and all the facts they were aware of. And I think as Danilo mentioned, it's really difficult for them and for us to understand, to get this information, because they are in an enormous amount of pain and distress, not just because they were not aware of some of the details, but also because of the whole situation, because of how they were affected by this. We also were, I think we also, I can say that about Oleg's case, because when we got his testimony, and when he had to describe in detail about the specifics of torture and how he had been treated, it wasn't easy at all for him. It was extremely emotional for him and for us. So yes, in the context of ongoing war, it's extremely difficult to provide sufficient, well, not sufficient, but a lot of evidence to support our arguments. But we managed to find at least some to sort of describe and support our allegations about our arguments about what happened, about the circumstances of the attack. But also, of course, we did mention that in our application, and for the court in its case law, it's in such context, obviously it is the court's stance to rely on and to put the burden of proof on the respondent state, especially because they were in control at the time. So that would be the burden of proof here. Would be in the standard of proof would be that the Russia and Russian authorities, Russian armed forces, since they executed the attack and they were in control at the moment, they would carry a burden of proof against our complaints.
Thank you very much, Olga. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Max. Thank you, Danilo, for your contributions. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And with that, we will end the webinar. Thank you.